And one of the interesting side effects of this is that the result of the changes of technology and the thrift of technology is that you're having an expansion of the diversity of expression that is possible. Mm-hmm. And so it might well be that, you know, for every possible subject area, there's a readership, and that readership might only be 40. You know, but this is, you know, potentially the environment we're moving into. And one of the interesting areas to study is the doujinshi culture in Japan. This is fan-made publishing that is, you know, kind of hobbyist publishing that is a massive culture in Japan. There's a institution called Comiket, or Comic Market, which occurs twice a year, tracks about 500,000 consumers per day coming to get these you know, thousands of books that are produced by somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5,000 circle tables. Each circle is 4 to 5 people that are making this kind of fan-made publication with very good production value that maybe, you know, they make a couple of hundred. I mean, I picked up a zine about guinea pigs, you know, and you know, maybe they make a couple
Who's
hundred
not
of
interested
them.
in guinea pigs?
But, you know, there's just all kinds of opportunity for people to find ways to express themselves. And you know, here in the States, you're seeing that in the explosion of crowdfunding and the opportunity for crowdfunding to give voice to a lot of voices that previously were unable to be heard. So, you know, it's never been a good time to sell books. I think that's universally true. But it's a really good time to make them and get them out there if you're not concerned with making a living from them.
But the other way that I see technology changing publishing is where, and it's another example of self-censorship, which is where really the technological change has happened is the way that we interface with our customer. And so even 5 years ago, we had very little direct interaction with the customer. It would happen at a convention. If you happen to be at a comic store, it might happen there. People would write letters or send you emails. But with the advent of social media, where everybody is communicating at all times, our writers and editors are constantly faced with communication from people who say they are consumers. And I think that starts to become part of the question is, are they actually consumers? Or are they just people who are advocating because you publish something that they don't like? And where I think that's troublesome is that if you are an editor for my company and you're working on a comic book, a Transformers comic book or a Star Wars comic book, and you're constantly being berated on social media in a really vicious way, where you're being personally insulted, sometimes you're being physically threatened, that people are not acting with traditional social norms in the way that they're communicating with you, does that lead writers and editors and artists to self-censor because they don't want to put themselves in a position where they're having to face this online mob? And as I said, in many cases, an online mob that is really not their reader or potential customer. So, and one last example that social media for us was we publish a series of comics on the Powerpuff Girls, which was a cartoon that came back a couple of years ago. And one of the things that my company does to have commercial success is we do a lot of variant covers. So the content will remain the same, but there might be 4 or 5 different covers for collectors to collect. And those covers can range a pretty wide gamut of content. So for the Powerpuff Girls, the licensor of that content, who sold us the rights to do the Powerpuff comic books, wanted to do a cover that was examining what the Powerpuff Girls would look like as real teenagers, as real superhero teenagers, and not in the sort of manga style that they're presented traditionally in the cartoon. So the editor of that book, who was a woman, hired a female artist to do a representation of the Powerpuff Girls as teenage superheroes. And there was a retailer, actually not far from here in Michigan, who went online and said that we were sexualizing the Powerpuff Girls. So he was bringing his own bias to this cover, seeing sexuality where no sexuality was intended, which I can assure you from having spoken with both the editor and the artist. But because of social media, he was able to turn that into a story that then forced the licensor to come to us and say, we're not going to allow you to distribute that cover. So that cover, it was printed, it was in the distribution channel, but we had to pull it because this one single retailer said that he saw it as sexualized, and he was able to make enough noise via social media to get the licensor to say, we don't want to take that risk. We don't want to risk offending people.
So a few years back, must have been probably the
late 1990s, early 2000s, I got obsessed with this Japanese company and spent some time out there talking with them. And what they'd done was that they'd set up 400 essentially storefront operations throughout Japan, each one of which had huge printing plant in it. Digital print. This is the early days of real digital printing, where it wasn't sort of completely beyond the practical scope of things to have an actual desktop publishing thing where you could actually sort of go in there and produce a book yourself using the machine. And this was the idea, was that people could go in and they could actually make books. And the guy who ran it had this sort of vision that he was going to radically democratize the act of authorship, where you take the act of authorship to be not just sort of writing a text, but going all the way from writing a text to arriving at your finished product, which is bound and wrapped, and then you can sell to someone. And it would incorporate and automate, actually, using early AI systems, things like page design, mise en page, that kind of thing. And it was a kind of amazing project, and it in the end collapsed, but it collapsed for an interesting kind of ancillary reason, which was that he was the first, this company was the first company, apparently, to digitize the entire kanji character set, which is about 50,000 characters in Japan. This was in the late 80s. And they got prosecuted, they got sued for copyright infringement by the typography industry. And the thing is that you can't actually copyright characters. They're in Japan or in Britain or America, you can't. There's reasons why, technical legal reasons why you can't, but you can't do it. But the idea was that you wrap up this small startup company in legal shenanigans for years until they basically run out of money. In my field of the history of the book, there's a famous line by a bibliographer from about 40 years ago to the effect that whatever it is that authors do, they don't make books. Because
I think in part one of the things we're getting at is the collaborative nature of producing a book, that there are many, many steps which all are more successful when professionalized, right?
But,
and you're going to get that better book cover.
There are tyrannical people in publishing. I mean,
you're going to get that better book cover when someone who really knows book cover design does it. And you're going to get that better copy edit when somebody like Teresa, who genuinely can look at a page of text and the typos like stand out in 3D. She isn't even conscious of reading line by line. It's a sort of superhuman development of copy editing capacity that shows up.
That's a superhuman proofreading. The superhuman copy editing thing is the voice in your head that goes, hold it, the moon was in a different phase 200 pages ago.
Yeah.
And we don't know how we do it, it's just there.
That the teamwork element is helpful, but any point at which an additional person is part of the process is a moment at which censorship can be injected into it, but only in the same way that, for example, the process of budgeting student clubs is a moment at which censorship can enter, because the dean of students in charge of the Maroon in 1951 can say, I'm going to pull the funding from this student club in order to silence the communist editor. Is this automatically a censoring moment? No. Is this a censoring apparatus? No. Is this a moment at which censorship can be injected into the process? Yes. And so the teamwork of publishing also means 20 new moments at which censorship can be injected into the process. But it doesn't mean that they have to be, or that they automatically are. But it means that they are moments in which the vulnerability is there. But in return for that increased vulnerability, you also have an enormous increase of teamwork, in addition to which all of these extra teammates are people who have your back against other forms of censorship. And if you have a censorious copy editor who's trying to remove all of the sex from your books, you go to your editor and you say, hey, Patrick, this terrible copy editor is doing a terrible thing to my book, and Patrick goes to bat for you from behind, because every member of the team could inject censorship, but can also inject resistance.